Hi, I'm Theo Jepsen from Stanford. I'm going to talk to you about our work on transaction triaging. This is a collaborative effort with my colleagues from the University of Fribourg, Università della Svizzera italiana, and Yale. Where do transactions spend their time? They spend a lot of time idle, moving through the network and host networking stack. During this time, the transaction is not being processed. This is because of the separation of concerns between the network and databases. The network doesn't know it's transporting transactions, so it can't help the database. But the network has become computational. We believe it's time for the scope of the database to expand into the network. Why is this especially important now? On multi-core systems, in-memory databases can now execute millions of transactions per second. But how can the network deliver millions of transactions to the server? The latest network interfaces can barely deliver transactions fast enough. But this requires using more precious CPU cycles. The database has to dedicate more resources to processing network requests instead of executing transactions. Networking adds a lot of overhead. How much overhead does a network add? We did an experiment to find out. We got the silo in-memory database and extended it with network support. We call it NetSilo. NetSilo uses a user-space networking stack to receive UDP transaction requests from clients. We executed transactions of increasing sizes by varying the number of rows accessed. With small transactions, the throughput is higher. However, less time is spent executing the transaction. The overhead with small transactions reaches 70%. And with other benchmarks, we see the same thing. TPCC experiences 53% overhead, and YCSB has 96% overhead. Where does this overhead come from? There are many sources. When a packet arrives, the NIC sends an interrupt to the database server. This causes context switches, which are expensive. The database may be split into multiple partitions, each managed by a different core. Transactions can arrive at the wrong database partition. This causes communication between the cores, either moving transaction or the data being accessed. And transactions aren't executed in any particular order, but just the order in which they arrive. This means that there's poor cache reuse. Furthermore, here I just showed the requests, but a lot of overhead is also from generating piecemeal responses. And these problems cannot be addressed in the server alone. We have to find a solution earlier in the network. The network already does routing, so why not do triaging? Our solution is to start processing transactions early in the network before they reach the database server. This way, the server doesn't waste CPU cycles on communication. The server can do what it's supposed to do, execute transactions. How do we do this though? With the emergence of programmable networks, it is now possible to do in-network computing. We designed a transaction manager that runs in the network. It handles transactions before they reach the server. We call this transaction triaging. Transaction triaging coordinates transaction delivery between the switch and the server's NIC. We've come up with 4 techniques so far. First, we can batch transactions. We can deliver multiple transactions to the database in the same packet. When the server responds, we also have to split the batch response packets and deliver the individual responses to each client. We can also steer transactions to the right database core. This reduces latency. We can reorder transactions, so transactions that have an affinity for each other are executed together. And if clients don't support advanced protocols like RDMA, we can transparently convert the protocols. These techniques may be trivial to implement on a general-purpose CPU, but we're not designing them for a general-purpose computer. We need to build these algorithms for new networking devices. Triaging in a general-purpose CPU is trivial. How hard can it be to do batching on an x86 processor? It's just managing a list. The problem is that switches are built to move massive amounts of data and perform computations on the fly. They're not general-purpose processors. The computing units in a switch are called stages, and they are similar to cores. But they are connected in a strictly forward chain or pipeline. A switch program specifies the conditions or actions to be performed at each stage. A program doesn't fetch data, but the data flows through the program. It's no wonder our traditional data structures can't simply be ported to this model. We need to redesign data structures and processes, the triaging techniques. And they also need to coexist on the switch, which is another challenge. In our paper, we introduce a class of feed-forward algorithms, along with new pseudocode notation for this model. Let's look at one of them, batching. The switch has to maintain a set of batches, where batch is basically a list of transactions. Normally with a list, we'd have a pointer to the head, to the tail, and a counter. That doesn't work here. We need an array-based version of a list. And that's not all. In the pipeline, we have one chance to traverse the list for each packet. For instance, let's say we update the counter at the end of an insertion. If we need to test that the batch is full and take an action such as drain the batch, it will be too late because the counter is at the end of the pipeline. We've already traversed the entire queue. This is a simple problem to solve. We just put the counter before the queue. And when a new transaction arrives, we first increment the counter and test it before the traversal. This illustrates the kind of constraints encountered in this programming environment. And I just showed you how we implemented one data structure. We also had to design others, like queue selection, reordering, and response splitting, and many more. When multiple algorithms are on the switch, they may use different stages, and this causes the computation to spread over stages, and we don't have many of them. So there's a constant balance between data placement and availability of compute cycles that makes designing algorithms in this environment interesting. And did I mention that if algorithms work here, they automatically work at line rate? That means that it can produce 5 to 6 billion results per second on the latest generation switches. We're clearly in acceleration territory. Let's see some results. Batching increases the throughput for the YCSB A workload. Compared to NetSilo, the baseline silo database with user space networking, we see an almost 8x increase in throughput. Compared to the NetSilo RDMA baseline, batching doubles the throughput. How about more complex workloads? We ran the TPCC benchmark with an increasing number of cores per warehouse. As we increase the contention, the throughput consistently decreases. Batching does not provide a significant benefit to the RDMA baseline. The reordering technique, on the other hand, has higher throughput. This is because it delivers transactions of the same type together, reducing conflicts. You should also see our paper to understand how triaging helps at the microarchitectural level. New networking technologies have made transaction triaging possible. As databases get faster, they need to use triaging to keep up with the network. We've shown that triaging speeds up different workloads. In some cases, it's even faster than executing transactions locally. If databases are going to scale, they must consider the entire transaction lifecycle, starting from the network. Thank you.